Welcome everybody to today's workshop on accessibility and ePortfolios. My name's Peter McLellan. I am at Oxford College of Emory University in the state of Georgia in the US, and I am here with Kevin Kelly, who is coming to us from San Francisco State University in California. So today we're going to talk about accessibility and accessible ePortfolios. This is a partnership between the AAEEBL Digital Ethics Task Force and ePortfolio Ireland. So today we're going to make sure that everybody kind of has an understanding of what the Digital Ethics Task Force is. We're going to give Orna Farrell a chance to give an overview of ePortfolio Ireland for those who don't know. Then we're going to cover kind of the accessibility principle and also what these principles are when we use that term. We're going to talk a bit about what accessibility might look like in practice with some practical examples of accessible ePortfolio design. And we'll also give you all a chance to kind of do some work with accessibility in documentation, artifacts, media that you use in your everyday life. Moving on to discussion. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with a discussion on strategies for supporting students with accessible portfolio design as well. Before we get started, I just want to make sure that, especially as we're talking about fairly sensitive subject matter, that we can all agree on these bullet points for a safe as possible session. First, we want to note that everybody here is present to learn and challenge preconceived notions and biases, and so this can be a vulnerable space. We also want to make sure that everybody's here is ready to listen without judgment, to be open to receiving feedback, and to discussing an argument, not a person, when disagreements do arise. And finally, any sort of details that people share here should be kept confidential. And do note that you can change your Zoom handle if you would like to remain anonymous during these conversations. Before we go any further, though, I want to throw it over to Orna to talk a bit about ePortfolio Ireland.
Thanks, Kevin. I just thought I'd give us a shameless plug while I was here. There's some of our members are in the audience. Hello, Nolene and Sheila and Edel and Catherine and Natalia. They're all friends of ePortfolio Ireland. So just a little bit of background about us briefly. We started up as a Mahara user group, I think it was 2017, and then we began to interact with colleagues and other institutions who were not interested in Mahara or using different platforms. So we broadened it out to be ePortfolio Ireland. So it's a practitioner and research-focused professional network. We started off with a higher ed focus, but our members are very diverse now. We have people in further education as well, a couple of people in secondary education. So quite a broad group. We have an email address and a Twitter handle if you're interested. Oh, I think that was made on Canva, Jeff. We're very do-it-yourself, DIY community. And we have a Twitter handle as well. And over our kind of 5 years, which actually sounds very long, we have developed lots of resources. They're all open access and available on the website. We have some really nice books and exemplars of different portfolio assessment. We have a rubric. Our most recent work was a special issue of a journal. So I'll come to that in a sec. So if you want to advance the slide, I'm not sure who's in charge of the slide. That's just the community, myself and colleague. These are the steering group members, we call it. Not the whole community. Karen, Tom, and Laura. And that's our most recent project. In the next slide, we created a special issue in collaboration with the Irish Learning Technology Association with their journal, the IJ Tell. And thanks for sharing the link, Christina. It's a special issue of ePortfolio in Ireland. We felt there was a big gap. A lot of the research we had encountered about portfolios centered on other contexts. So we decided to try and fill this gap we created this open access special issue. It has about 15 different articles, mostly written by women, and was published kind of at the end of the pandemic, or if the pandemic is actually over. But you might be interested. There's some very nice themes. Professional learning was a big theme. We kind of reflective assessment. There's new disciplinary themes as well. So, for example, there's one about business. There's one about creative arts. There's one about nursing. So the disciplinary aspect is building. And there's there's a nice one about social justice as well. So there's a very good range of articles if you'd like to check it out. And that's my piece. Thanks, Kevin. I'll hand back to you, I think.
Thanks, Orna.
Or Peter. Sorry, Peter.
Appreciate it. And thank you all for being here. So for our shameless plug, we're going to talk a little bit about what the Digital Ethics Task Force is as part of AAEEBL. So here is our fearless warband, and there's, oh gosh, how many of us are there now? I guess I can count, but yeah. So we are our numbers seem to be swelling, and our membership draws from across the world. So we have folks primarily though in the US and in Australia and New Zealand. So the task force was developed in 2019 to address a sort of gap within the ePortfolio community and beyond, identifying the conversation of digital ethics as an underdeveloped area of research and scholarship. And something that is an exciting space to kind of ask these questions and have these conversations, because technologies, laws, practices are all changing. And so for us as members of AAEEBL, this was a chance for us to kind of advocate for ethically sound portfolio practice as a sort of international group. So it began in 2019 with a call out for members, and the initial kind of work. So our programming kind of revolves, operates with the sort of academic calendar and with AAEEBL's annual meeting as kind of an anchor point for our kind of year of work. And in our first year, focused primarily on developing 10 initial principles of digital ethics, of which accessibility is one. And in subsequent years, we've either added principles or kind of pared them down, refined them, and now we are kind of moving out, well, I guess past July 2022, to kind of bring the news to the masses and spread the gospel of what we're doing here in order that folks can engage in more accessible portfolio practice. So when I'm talking about the principles, we mean some very specific things. So we've developed digital ethics principles for ePortfolio practice. You all see there's a tiny link down at the bottom. If you all want access to those, we'll also be sharing this out later, link to our digital ethics principles. And we really only have time to go through accessibility because there's a lot here. But all that is to say, each principle is broken down into 4 distinct parts. So there's always kind of a statement, overview, kind of brief definition of what the principle itself is or means. Then there are actual sort of notes on how you might think about applying that principle to your context and your work. Then we offer some scenarios, usually from various different communities of practice or accountability within a given institution. So if you think from the perspective of an administrator, of faculty, or students, we help you think a little bit more about how to bring those principles into your sort of everyday life within your given role. And then we provide further reading and resources for you to consider kind of how you can bring those principles into practice.
Peter, if I may, can
yeah,
I just
please.
chime in 1 second?
Sure.
So know, everyone, that even though we're in year 4 of the task force and we're constantly revising and working on them, we appreciate feedback from events like this when people are exposed to the principles for the first time. How could it be easier to actually not only consume and review the principles, but put them into practice? Those scenarios, as Peter mentioned, are not only a variety of stakeholders, but we intentionally tried to create space for all of the people who might interact with ePortfolios. And for those who aren't using ePortfolios yet, you still may be using some sort of digital assignments or online work for students to do where these principles would still apply. And those scenarios, because I know we have some folks here from different ePortfolio platform providers like PebblePad and Digication and Mahara, we want to make sure that you know that you're considered in these as well. So it goes all the way from the student to the faculty member to the staff members on a campus that might support that faculty member, all the way up to the platform providers themselves, and thinking about the way these digital ethics challenges that we all faced today in the 21st century kind of are interconnected with all of these different stakeholder groups. And so we invite everyone, no matter what role you play, all the world's a stage, right? So we are all players in the same thing here. Back to you, Peter.
Thanks, Kevin. That's really helpful. So, as y'all know, we're going to be moving on to thinking about the accessibility principle today. By and large, this principle is focused on, making ePortfolios accessible to as many people as possible. We believe that ePortfolio pedagogy is the sort of high impact practice of high impact practices. But it's not going to be able to do that work if folks don't have access to learning through portfolios. So we want to make sure within this principle, we want to make sure that the portfolios are accessible first to people who are creating the portfolios, so the students who are actually kind of doing the work within those spaces. Accessible for the educators who are using them within their classrooms. And then we also want to make sure that students, as we're going to talk about today, are themselves educated on accessible design, so that when they are sharing their work with one another and with others, that they themselves are making their learning, which they're presenting out and making visible to the world, is accessible to all potential audiences. So we think about kind of putting these into practice, putting accessibility into practice. We want to recognize, first of all, that for a variety of reasons, not every technology platform is going to be accessible to everyone. And as folks who, if you're folks who deploy these places in your classroom, we can't rely on technology vendors to be the sort of the experts on accessibility for our particular spaces. That is the job of our community to help us determine exactly what our community itself needs. So that means that when you are vetting, say, an ePortfolio platform, when you want to think about purchasing a particular one, you may, for example, want to talk to your Office of Inclusion or Disabilities or something similar, and also to have conversations with affected students and staff to make sure that the platforms that you're engaging are the most accessible platforms possible. We want to make sure that there's enough space for faculty and staff to be trained on accessibility standards for ePortfolio content creation. And we're going to discuss this in detail later, but you also want to make sure that your students themselves are trained on best practices for accessible ePortfolio design. Oops. And then finally, you want to think about portfolio design. As you're thinking about portfolio design, it's oftentimes a great strategy to check in with some of your, say, local government or ethical standards community groups. So you might have the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines for those in the US. The ADA might offer some resources to help you think a little bit more about what accessibility looks like. Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, things like that. At the end of the slideshow, we also have some links to some resources, both in the US and in Ireland, to help you think more about accessible portfolio design. I'm going to throw it over to Kevin here.
Thanks. So we thought it would be, the principles themselves are set at different levels with the overarching concept, the strategies, and the scenarios. But we wanted to give some practical ideas as well of what it might look like. So on the next slide, just thinking through what are the different needs and accommodations that might require us to consider accessibility. Who are the different folks who are engaging with ePortfolios, who are creating those artifacts to display to others. And so thinking through, as Peter mentioned, the different needs, we can see that visual impairments might require something like a screen reader or an audio description. Hearing impairment might require captioning videos if you're going to allow students to use those videos to share their reflections on how the artifacts tie to the coursework, to their professional goals, to other aspects of how you're using the portfolio to help them show what they know or show what they're ready to do. And then we also want to make space for the live events around the activities. If students are sharing their work in small groups in a live setting, then will there be a need for any sort of transcription? Or as you can see, we have auto transcript here on this particular Zoom session. People can turn on the subtitles or not as they wish. But in some cases, if someone has a specific accommodation need, then you might have a live transcription or a sign language interpreter. When we think about other types of needs, we can think about speech, mobility, cognitive and learning disabilities. So all those things play a role. And when we think about it even at a deeper level, Microsoft did a study in around 2011 and identified that even though the group of people who request accommodations may be small at your institution, usually around 8 to 10%. The accommodation strategies that we use to support those individuals actually support up to 65% of the population, because not everybody reports whether or not they need an accommodation. They don't want to address things where they feel they might be stigmatized or treated differently. They want to be like everyone else, but also there are people who are at varying degrees of need. So they may not be completely visually impaired, but they may have impairments. A colleague of mine with whom I work appreciates when I remember to turn on the captions for our just one-on-one meetings, because she's hard of hearing. And so all these different things come into play, not only for the ePortfolio work and the artifacts, but all the activities that we facilitate around them, whether it be preparing students to complete the work, engaging them in peer review activities, and so on. So on the next slide, you can see some work straight out of AAEEB Ireland, and AAEEB Ireland is a group dedicated to accessibility and making sure that people are able to engage in different processes. And so they share some different strategies here, like letting students know that they can express concerns regarding accessibility of assessment methods. You might want to provide some sort of anonymous means for them to do that, again, so that they don't feel like they have to identify themselves. Also supporting students in choosing and using different assessment methods. Orna put in the chat UDL, which stands for Universal Design for Learning. Many people are familiar with that, but providing multiple pathways for students to show what they know is directly described in their multiple means for action and expression. And so giving them the opportunity to use different formats for submission, different methods of basically meeting the learning outcomes in an ePortfolio context, all these things are important. And some of the things that we understand from other parts of universal design for learning, scaffolding the process by providing sample assignment submissions, maybe a rubric if you're going to use it, or some other things like templates. Some folks in the ePortfolio world do ask their students to fill in a template so that they're fairly consistent across a class. Others provide a little bit more flexibility, but still ask students to use the same headers or titles or things like that. The last couple here on this slide, and it's not an exhaustive list, making sure that assessment text and images follow accessibility guidelines, and checking your assessments with any campus unit that supports accessibility. And I know that that may not exist on your campus, sticking with that last slide for just one more second, because here in California, for example, we have 116 community colleges just in our state. It's one of the largest community college systems in the world, with about 2 million students. And so the challenges are that when they last conducted a survey, only about 40% of the schools had a person dedicated to instructional design, and even a smaller percentage had any staff member, even part-time, dedicated to helping faculty with accessibility issues. Those folks who are in those units for students with disabilities, supporting them in their learning, often don't cross over and support the faculty until a student has been identified as being in that class. So there's often not much time for instructors to prepare. And so it's important for all of us who are working with faculty members to create a proactive approach and mentality so that people are not scrambling to make their entire course and set of ePortfolio activities accessible in just a matter of days or weeks. Now on the next slide, we also thought it would be important just to share. Some people may be wondering, well, what can I do? What are some things that I can do myself or tell my students about? And if you break it down into 4 categories, there are 7 basic accessibility techniques that you can consider, whether it be text on a web page or in some sort of document that might provide the instructions, or a template for what students are going to do. Things like using heading styles, or using the bulleted or numbered lists, the buttons that actually create the bullets, as opposed to just drawing a dash or putting in a character that looks like a bullet, like an asterisk. Using descriptive text for either links. How many of you have gone to a website, including an ePortfolio, where they may have a whole paragraph describing something very well, but then the link to do more just says 2 words, click here. And anyone with a screen reader hits that, and it will basically just tell them click here, but they don't know where they're going or why they should go there. So using descriptive link text is important to help people determine what they're doing when they click that link. And then using alternative text for images if someone's using a screen reader again, so that they're getting the same information that a person with full vision can gain from looking at that. The last things that are important related to color, providing sufficient contrast, typically 75 or 80% contrast. 100% is black on white, but if you put like a lemon yellow color on white, that's a very low contrast and hard for a lot of people to read. And then using more than just color to convey meaning. Some people might put something in red text to connote that it's very important, but someone who's colorblind might not actually see that. And so using red text and bold, or red text in italics, would allow that person to see that you're using some sort of formatting to show that that text means something more than just a sentence. Last but not least, tables. If you're using tables, use what are called header rows and columns, so that people who are, again, using screen readers will be guided through the table, and it'll repeat some of the things in those headers as they get further and further into the table. So they're not trying to hold in memory everything that you've put on that particular piece of information. On the next slide, we wanted to put everything in context. Again, we're thinking about assignments that we ask students to complete. We're thinking about the work that we do to prepare them to do those assignments. And then finally, preparing students to engage with different audiences, whether it be their peers in a peer review process, whether it be us as instructors or instructional designers, whether it be employers or career centers. There's a variety of groups. Their families and friends, if they're students who are trying to share out to the world their work so that people can see what they're accomplishing as they go through their academic career. So this accessibility and context, we break it down into the content that learners might review to complete an assignment, and those formats might be text or audio, video, or some sort of multimedia. The instructions for completing that assignment, which I've described before, which again could include text, images, video, or screencasts, something that helps students understand what they're expected to do and how they can be successful. And then the environments themselves. And I brought up earlier the vendors and the ePortfolio platform providers. But there's also learning management systems where we might be engaging students in discussions, and other areas where students may be going out and finding their own spaces like Wix or Google websites or other places where they may choose to build portfolios or construct the work. I heard Orna say that they made the ePortfolio Ireland logo in Canva. And so is that environment accessible if we recommend it to students to make their own logos for their work? Those are the types of things that we want to at least have some idea so that we can suggest things that we've vetted or that someone on our campus has vetted. On the next slide, we have just an example. So here in my own course called How to Learn with Your Mobile Device, it's an undergraduate lower division general education course, fully online. And I ask students to complete artifacts throughout our term, which is 16, 17 weeks long. And at the end, I give them options about the format of what they can submit, trying to follow those universal design for learning strategies, as well as trying to increase students' media literacy. And so what I ask them all to do is I ask them to write a draft outline or essay that answers specific question prompts. Then, because I enforce and encourage them to think of writing, media development, any process that they're going through with respect to ePortfolios and otherwise as an iterative process. And so once they have that draft, then they can choose what's the format they wish to submit. Do they want to stick with text and write it up as an essay or a blog post? Do they want to turn it into a presentation and use maybe Google Slides or VoiceThread? Do they want to create some sort of screencast video or maybe just record themselves and put it on YouTube? In some cases, where I've had students who are living in their car and couldn't submit written work very easily because they didn't want to type essays with their thumbs, I told them, hey, why don't you write your essay with pen and paper? And I've got a free Google Voice phone number that you can call and recite your essay as a voicemail message, and I can grade it using the same rubric as I use for written work, because I can see that you've made the transitions, that you've supported your arguments, and so on. So this is just an example of an ePortfolio assignment where we're trying to get students to show that they've met certain learning outcomes, but they have a choice in a number of formats to submit it, and it's all graded with the same rubric. And I think that might be everything for this section. Yes, so I think I'm handing it back to Peter.
Great, thanks, Kevin. So we know that this can seem like a lot, and so what we wanted to do is we wanted to give you all a chance to practice doing this work within your context, or at least envisioning what doing this work would look like within your context. And so we're going to kind of help you level up some of your accessibility practices for your ePortfolio work within your institution. You know, one of the terms that we use for professional development at my institution, and perhaps some of your others, is that we want to +1 your accessibility work. So that meaning just pick one thing from your work and one new strategy that you can take to improve accessibility at your place of work. And so what I would like y'all to do is, as I finish up talking here, think about and then hopefully find somewhere on your computer or around you some sort of an artifact. Could be an assignment, could be some sort of support documentation or media that you have for ePortfolio work. It could even be if you've created ePortfolio templates for your work. It could be your own portfolio. And then if you are not currently doing ePortfolio work at your institution, you're here because you're just curious, or you want to learn about accessibility in general, think about some other sort of well-used thing at your institution, like a form or some sort of general education type documentation that you use at your school or place of work. And then what we want you to do is is to interrogate that chosen artifact against the accessibility principles. So you can we have a bit.ly here for that'll take you right to the principle itself. So it's bit.ly/EP/or-accessibility. So when you're looking at this particular artifact, try to find places where it's inaccessible, and also to make notes for whom and how it's inaccessible. Then take a look at some of the strategies presented that you can deploy, and think about what that would look like with this particular artifact. And then after you've done that, take a look at start thinking about some of your institution and some of the barriers that might be logistical, they might be cultural, whatever those look like. What are some of the barriers to this +1 changes that you've made? So I think what we can do is we'll give you, this will be somewhat silent kind of workshop time for you all. If you have questions, just feel free to speak up or put them in the chat, and Kevin and I will be happy to help. If you want us to share some previous slides while you're working, we can certainly do that too. But I think right now, maybe take 8 to 10 minutes and really dig into, your archives of artifacts from your work and +1 them. Alrighty. So, what did y'all find? What did you take a look at?
And in the spirit of UDL, you can either raise your hand to speak up or pop it in the chat.
Maybe to make a start here.
Please.
Can you read? So for the manual that I'm writing for Mahara, I've noticed that I was actually doubling up alt text and captions. So the captions are the visible parts underneath the images, and the alt text is the hidden part. And what I hadn't yet done was actually go through and remove the alt text from all the images, because I do have the captions that do mention what is in the screenshot. And because describing screenshots in general is quite difficult in an alt caption, so I'm thinking to just remove all the alt text and go with a caption, because then the description of what is in the screenshot is below it, making it easier for people who are using screen readers, because then the text isn't doubled up for them. And so this was a good opportunity to look a bit more into that and then make a swooping change with getting rid of 571 occurrences in a few seconds.
Now, it's a really good point that sometimes we may be providing too little information for people who need accommodations, and then sometimes we may be providing too much. So that's a good awareness generation there. Thanks, Christina. Gail, I
That's
see
kind
you
of
have your. Go ahead, please.
So sorry, just as a follow-on, not that it sounds like captions and alt text are exactly the same thing. They are definitely not, and they should be different if you have them different. But if they happen to be the same, then have one or the other, but not both at the same time.
Thanks. Gail.
Hi, everybody. One of the things that I still continue to struggle with is, again, along this idea of images. Images, we know, are so important. However, they have to be part of the story, right? You can't just have I don't think you should have an image just for the sake of having an image. That gets very confusing when, you have people that are visually impaired trying to explain this unimportant or irrelevant image. So I think taking a good hard look at images that you have to make sure that they add to your message and add to your story or the assignment, I think is really important. And the same goes with banners. I love banners, but when you put text on top of a banner, then that really, nobody can read the text because it's all part of an image. So having your text below the banner to, so that the screen reader can pick that up, I think is another lesson that I have to keep teaching myself.
Thanks, Gail. And you make me think of, there's another phenomenon with respect to images. Once we find images or create images that actually complement the material that we're asking students to review or the instructions, if we create a complex diagram, like a flow chart, helping students see the process they should follow to complete an activity or something like that, that might require more than just alternative text, right? Because alternative text is meant to be, 5 to 10 words roughly, to give students and any viewer who's using a screen reader a chance to understand what's being presented there. But if it's a complex diagram, a molecule in the sciences, or something related to some field like engineering that's got schematics, then you might need to use something like a long description, or have basically what I like to tell students is pretend you're describing this over the phone to a friend and they can't see it. What would you tell them? And then that becomes another way for students or for us to convey that visual information. I see Orna's got her hand up.
Sorry, just moving somewhere quieter. So I've tried two things this year, trying to integrate more UDL into my practice. The first thing is a really simple thing, is for my lecture slides, using a simple font like Arial, and also using a cream background, and being very careful about how I use headings. I believe is better for accessibility. And then the second thing I've done it with an ePortfolio assignment is similar to you, Kevin. I gave students the choice of submitting text, video, or audio. I've only just got the first set of submissions, so I have to look at what they've done. So again, that kind of similar multiple means of expression. So that's me.
Thanks,
two accessibility things I'm trying to do.
Need a +2.
Orna.
I just want to jump in. Thank you, Orna. We've mentioned something called UDL, I think, a couple of times here, and that stands for Universal Design for Learning. I think it's been around since '99, but I can't remember for sure. When Kevin's doing his next thing, I might be able to quick dig up some good documentation on it. But by and large, universal design is the sort of notion that the notion that if you design something for the most marginalized among us, it makes life easier for all of us. And that principle has been applied from architecture into learning. And so there's a number of principles beyond the principles we've provided that make learning itself more accessible to all learners by making sure that everybody has the ability to learn. Jeff, you have your hand up?
Oh yeah. I was gonna say that because we built a lot of tools, and there are a few extensions and tools that you can also install sometimes that can help you figure out whether your content is accessible or whether the tool that you are trying to evaluate is accessible. Just keep in mind that they're not totally foolproof. Sometimes being compliant to, for example, the WCAG, standards doesn't necessarily mean it's actually usable. But I think that the couple of tools that are really easy to use, one of them doesn't even require any actual installation. I'll pop it in the chat, and it's called Andy, and it's created. It's an accessibility testing tool, and all you have to do is to drag this one thing into your extension. Your bookmark bar, and you can check out accessibility as tested by Andy to any websites. Just know that the caveat here is that it gets very technical. So it will sometimes throw a bunch of JavaScript, tell you that there's a bunch of JavaScript errors or a bunch of labels that are not there, and you don't actually know what it means. So this is where, you start to have to get deep into the understanding of what it all really means and whether it matters. And so, but it's a really, I think, effective way for people who want to go deeper than just making sure whether an image has alt tags. That's all.
Well, that's plenty. Thanks for sharing that, Jeff.
Yeah.
Others, not just about these different accessibility challenges and accommodation strategies, but how about your plus ones that you worked on over that brief period, or things that you're thinking about and have questions about how to do it?
Laura mentioned in the chat, she says, I'm also considering how I can incorporate varied ways for students to express their learning. Reflection doesn't need to be only in written format, so how can I encourage video or audio reflection as well, or in UDL speak, separating the means from the ends, while also making it accessible to all? Yeah. I think, at least for me, in the classroom, it's been, it's felt easier for me to kind of like provide multiple means of explaining the material to students. For some reason, that feels easier, but it's always a little riskier to provide them multiple means of creating, learning content. And so I think in some ways, I think that's a bigger challenge for us. And I just want to name that, there's a certain vulnerability that comes in telling your students to take charge of the media that they use to express their learning. And so there's a challenge in this that goes beyond the work.
I agree, Peter. And I'll tell you, the slide that I showed earlier about providing choice for students, it doesn't show the evolution of that particular set of instructions. So being young and foolhardy, this is many years ago, because you can see I have gray hair now. And it's probably because of my students putting me through the paces. But when I first began studying UDL in the early 2000s, I admit I was walking around with a loaded idea and not quite trained how to use it yet. And so I gave my students the license to choose whatever format they wanted without putting into place that process and structure and some explanation for why they might choose different formats and how they can be successful. So you can imagine that I got, for what should have been a one-page assignment or maybe a 3 to 5 minute video, some 20-minute rambling exposés on how they could do something, and then finally they got to the topic and showing that they met the learning outcomes. And so I had to really watch a 20-minute video 2 or 3 times so that I could see if they actually did. So I ended up making more work for myself and more work for the students because I didn't really light up the runway for them. And so that slide that we showed earlier, that whole concept of providing them with a common set of prompts with everyone completing a draft outline or essay is really to frame it so that it could act as a script or a set of talking points for a presentation or a video. It could act as the basis for a photojournalism essay or something that incorporates media, or even a set of discussion points in an infographic. But I again tell students to think about who their audience is, what they're producing. And now I'm creating, because of requirements for general education in California, I'm actually creating a 4-part series where they're told who the audience is and the topic for the assignment, but they have some freedom within that. Then they are going to choose their approach in a rhetoric sense for how they're going to convince that audience about their argument. Then they're going to learn more about publishing for a specific format, whether it be web or video or what have you. So they're not just winging it, but they have concrete strategies for being successful in conveying their ideas in different ways that they may not have used before. Whether they be, we all make assumptions that our students are tech savvy, but we have plenty of returning students who just want to get the work done and go back to taking care of their kids or doing their work for employment. And so you make a really good point, Peter, that it's following these practices requires more than just using the words from the guidelines that provide multiple means of doing something. It can be a little bit loaded. Christine, I see you've had your hand up patiently while I've rambled on. Please.
Thank you, Kevin. And Laura, I think you're posing a really good question and a very important one that I'm sometimes still struggling with how to make multimedia content accessible. I mean, in terms of how to, I know that you can have a transcript or subtitles, but sometimes it does feel, especially if you have a long session to transcribe like this one, that it can be a lot of effort. And so, of course, we fortunately these days have tools that help us with it. So the automatic transcription, so that you don't have to type everything yourself, but you're reviewing it and can then just correct it, which definitely saves a lot of time. I think now also some presentation tools come with built-in audio recording capabilities and also transcription capabilities, which will then also make that easier. And Jeff mentioned a number of accessibility tools earlier, and they can also give tips of how to improve, for example, alt text, or if you want to describe images, pointing to examples, or then also for video that we can say, well, where can we publish a transcript? Because accessibility doesn't mean that it needs to be a one-to-one representation. So, for example, if it is too difficult to do subtitles because you might not have a platform like YouTube because you want to keep your video internally and that doesn't allow you to put subtitles in, you can still provide a transcript so that people can read through that. And that is already another good accessible step, so that you don't always have to go the full 9 yards if you don't have the tools available, yet still can make it easier for somebody who cannot perceive the video to still access it, and therefore see what you can do with the tools available to you already.
I'm interested in a couple of the other questions that have been posed previously, and I'm going to ask them together just because, as any of my students will tell you, I have trouble asking just one question. But what do you all see as some of the barriers at your institutions, organizations to, just making your work in whatever way it looks more accessible? And also, do you have resources at at your institution for kind of making learning in general more accessible to students?
Yeah, I can speak to that.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, we have a technology team, and then we have workshops in the summer, and they tell us about. I put a list of some of the resources in the chat that I got from the summer, and they have workshops explaining how we can check if our material is accessible, and reasons why we might want to do that. Universal design for learning, alternate assignments, and so on. So yeah, I would say that we have good resources, and if anything comes up, we can during the academic year we can always contact them, and they'll give us support.
Laura mentions in the chat a barrier I found from some on my campus. If we allow video audio reflections, won't that be harder to assess? Yeah, so attitude is cultural attitude is a big one too. I think it's also not uncommon to see, in addition to that, sort of, does this make the learning less rigorous? You know, because folks attach kind of your traditional test or paper, you know, learning assessments to be kind of the more rigorous type of work, rather than thinking about what the sort of actual reframing that happens in learning in many different ways looks like. Yeah.
And to answer Laura's question a little more directly, I would say it depends on how you set it up. So again, if you ask that regardless of what format your reflection takes, it needs to accomplish specific goals. If you provide a rubric that shows the criteria that they're expected to meet, no matter what format they submit, then it shouldn't be harder to assess. And when I give feedback on media submissions versus text, I use the same feedback. You didn't mention any citations or support for your arguments, so I need to see that. And I often will make sure that there's a draft, because a lot of students aren't accustomed to having the freedom of creating alternative format. They're used to writing and doing work that's been constructed for them, or it follows a pretty pattern-like format. So giving them a road to success with a comprehensive overview of what's expected, some strategies like UDL might prescribe, or the transparent assignment template, if you're familiar with that, from the Transparency in Learning and Teaching group, Tilt Higher Ed. I'll put that link in the chat in a second. But they talk about, hey, think about providing templates or examples of what strong work should look like, or rubrics, checklists. All those things help students determine what they're supposed to do and how they can meet the requirements successfully. And I see Jeff Yan in the chat suggests, if people are really interested in accessibility, he recommends a course from University of Illinois, looks like. And it's a 3-course certificate program taught by awesome faculty. Other plus ones, other challenges folks are trying to address at their institutions, whether you're a faculty member or a staff member supporting faculty, or someone working on a portfolio platform or some other platform that students and faculty might be using.
Thank you all so much for sharing. I know some of this can be vulnerable talk, and so I appreciate you discussing some of the challenges that you faced. Kevin, you ready to move on?
You bet. So thinking through, and we've started touching on some of these topics, but how do we engage our students in the conversation? So we are one vector, right? And we can control a certain amount of the work and the instructions and all that. But if we're going to engage students in peer review exercises, if we're going to have them give each other feedback about their work in less formal ways, like having them get into Zoom breakouts and share their work and get constructive feedback so they can go back and make revisions. However we engage students, even if we want them to create accessible artifacts so that their colleagues and peers can review them, all point to the fact that we can't do it all ourselves. We need to engage students in the process. And so on the next slide, you'll see actually an idea that addresses Laura's original question about text versus video. And in my own class, for discussions around artifacts, I give students the capability of either typing up text, including screenshots of the things that they are talking about. They would use alt text for those screenshots, and we discuss the need for that in our norm setting, community norms that we create as a class at the beginning of the term. But also here you can see a tool called, now it's called Flip. It used to be called Flipgrid. But it, as Christina mentioned earlier, has auto-generated captions for 3-minute, 5-minute videos that students create on their phones. And I ask the students to go through and edit those captions because Flip provides a pathway to do so. And I show a link to the tutorial on how to do that so that any student that chooses to use video rather than text can do so in an accessible way. And then you can see this last bullet. If I know that there's a student in my class who brings with them a sign language interpreter for class sessions that are live, then we would again create a space where we can help students work with the sign language interpreter to support them and the students that they support. For example, if we know we're going to have breakout rooms where students are presenting their work, then creating brief lists of specialized vocabulary so that those interpreters may be ready for it, especially in highly technical disciplines or things that might use things that are not common. So if they have to spell it out, if there's not a quick word to use, what have you. And also just using a different speed. I am a fast talker and I always have to convince myself that I need to slow down and give time for breathing, drinking water and things like that. But it also supports those who might be translating in real time as we go through these processes. So setting up strategies before the students get into these situations is part of what we can do to make accessibility first and foremost something that everybody thinks about. On the next slide, you can see that there are ways that we can, again, build it into an assignment, accessibility practices that students may not even consider. So again, Universal Design for Learning and other accessibility groups suggest that we want to support people who use screen readers, but also how do we support English language learners and even people who might have attention challenges. So here you can see two graphics. And if you were to see the alt text, one would say discussion forum titles with similar or exactly the same names. And then the other would say something like discussion forum titles that are unique. And so in my class, before I was practicing UDL and accessibility strategies as much as I am now, and I still have a long way to go, you can see something from early work where if you were to hit this discussion forum with a screen reader, you'd hear synthesis discussion, synthesis discussion, discussion, synthesis, link, synthesis discussion. So it's not very clear which link you should click and why. And so now I make it part of the assignment. Students get 1 point to create a 5 to 7 word title for their discussion post that summarizes what they've written. And then when students give replies, it's not just regarding X, it's again, a 5 to 7 summary, word summary of what they've said in response. And so you can see on this right-hand image, reminders to keep me on track, Wolfram Alpha as the way to exit math class, learning about rocks with purple X, Apple News for keeping me up to date. So you can see people of any walk of life can basically see what they want to attend to, what they want to open up and read and review and reply to. And that you can see Christina has in the chat, find a way to ban people from using the words here or click here for links. And so that you can see my bullet, which repeats something I shared earlier, asking students to use descriptive link text when they're creating links from their discussion posts. So it's not just the titles, but if they create links within their discussion posts, telling them strategies for making them descriptive as well. And then on the next slide, I think it's really a prompt. How do you engage students around accessibility? So we've talked about ways that we support students by making our work and our environments more accessible, but how do we engage students in accessibility practices? I'm curious to hear and read what you all are doing, because I know I'm not the only one. And if you're not doing it yet, what are some things that you think you might want to do?
Yeah, Jeff.
I have I think that the first time that I was genuinely thrown into just using a screen reader and was not allowed to use, to view the screen at all, to try to navigate through really just any website, any web page, was really tremendously useful. It just gives you a much more an experience that you can empathize, when you are not organizing your content well, or like Kevin was saying, you are not labeling your discussion topics. It just makes, a lot of the common sense kicks in, and that seems to be quite helpful. And so when I had worked with students, that's one of the things that we would do, is to have everyone turn on this either voiceover on the Mac or whatever other screen reader technology that they have access to, and just try using that itself. It obviously doesn't cover all different kinds of accessibility, but that just throws you into certainly, at least for those of us who are sighted, it throws you into an environment that you just have not had a chance to be in before.
I think, Jeff, that you make a really good point, and that comes down to the empathy, as Gail also just put into the chat, that unless we experience what the struggle is, that we can't really fully comprehend it. Because if you're using a Mac, it might also look different than when you're on Windows, and on Linux, I have a completely different screen reader. And when we do accessibility testing, we do need to test on other platforms, because everybody interprets things differently. And that then also helps us to understand, well, we cannot guarantee that a student uses a particular browser or a particular operating system or a particular device. Therefore, how can we make sure that it is more universally available in order to not push them into a direction that they might not be able to afford, or that they don't have readily available in their environment already. Kevin and Peter, I think we've talked quite a bit about kind of the web accessibility, which of course is a big part of what we've been doing in the principle and what we focused on in the principle. I'm wondering if anybody here in the group has some, and Kevin has already mentioned some of that in the workshop today, but if somebody has some more strategies to work especially with neurodiverse students, or Kevin, earlier you also mentioned students with ADHD, or others who can't concentrate for a long time, who need multiple reminders of where they're at to keep them focused. Are there some strategies and ideas that we can employ to either assist in the design of portfolio activities more, or also to make students aware how they can then view their portfolio from that perspective, because that of course is a bit harder to get to be empathetic about, I think, because we can't just turn to a technology and test it out ourselves.
One thing that I mean, I honestly hadn't thought about this in this way before, Christina, but one thing that's been really helpful at our institution and that we stumbled across on accident was through a survey of our students about how they engage technology. And our main LMS across campus is Canvas, and we learned that our students, so our faculty and staff, we're using our Outlook calendars to organize our day and to give us reminders on things. And so there's this assumption that students did too, which is a strange assumption considering they don't check their email. So like already, not the best assumption. But what we found is they were using calendars. They were using their Canvas calendar, and so that's changed the way that our office has worked with faculty in helping them reach out to students, because what we're doing is we're starting with where the students are in their everyday lives. And so when faculty want to give reminders now, we recommend that they kind of go through Canvas, recommend that they use Canvas in ways that pops up reminders onto their Canvas calendars, that they help students and use Canvas notifications properly, things like that. So to recommend that they're kind of plugged in so that we can reach them and remind them in those ways. And that's been really helpful and a total accident.
And going beyond, let's say, a Canvas calendar, I encourage my students, and again, my class is called How to Learn with Your Mobile Device. So the focus is on metacognition, self-regulated learning. And so I'm trying to give students strategies that they can take beyond my class to all learning situations while they're in college and when they are lifelong learners. And so I tell them at the beginning that in addition to the learning management system calendar, they should be using the calendars on their own devices and creating reminders, not just when things are due, which is going to tell them at the very last minute, hey, something's due, but when they should begin working on it, milestones, so that they get reminders with their phone or whatever device they set up, an email, whatever they prefer. I also encourage them to use online to-do lists so that they can think through, again, the entire workflow of an ePortfolio assignment or just a regular digital assignment, so that, again, when should they begin it? When should they review the materials to better understand the topic? All those different things. Teresa brings up that movement helps, providing opportunities for students to stand up, switch groups, or move around in the classroom if you're face-to-face. The same is true if you're engaging students on Zoom, so that they can feel free to not have to be behind the camera, but they can move around. Other ideas, these are great suggestions in the chat.
Yeah, Anna saying that multiple means of representation is important for students with ADHD who may be more comfortable and articulate when verbally discussing a topic, but procrastinate when they are provided written work, and also mentions mind maps.
And an aspect of assessment that's probably less related to ePortfolios, but if we're constructing, let's say, online quizzes to help students gauge for themselves if they understand the topic enough before beginning an ePortfolio assignment, you can set it up so that the questions only show one question per page, which helps students who do have attention challenges, so that they're not using the answers from one question and the question text from another and getting out of order, by limiting and still allowing them to go back and forth if they don't complete an answer, but allowing them to only see one question at a time is a strategy that supports them.
I also find that it's really useful to try to understand what type of, for example, ADHD people have. Some people's ADHD exhibits themselves in hyperfocusing. So it's not always about, not being able to focus. They actually get fixated on something. And so, and sometimes the fixation, however, could cause them not be able to do the work because they are trying so hard to do this one thing and sort of almost into a rabbit hole, if you will. And so understanding these things in sort of more depth beyond the sort of surface level allow you to react a little bit more appropriately for that particular instance.
And I see in the chat the strategy for having a breakout room available for quiet individual reflection. That is a very cool idea rather than forced group work. And back to the original prompt, are there ways that you are or ways that you would like to engage students in conversations around accessibility? People may still be ruminating, but we can also expand the question to just, I know we're getting toward the end of the content and activity part of this, thinking about the accessibility principle in general and any questions folks have about that and how they might use it to support their work is also, we'd love to support you moving from this workshop to practice. So it's not just a sit and listen, hey, those are good ideas, and I'll go back to my work as normal, but how can we incorporate some of these ideas, that +1 that Peter uses in our work? Sheila, you mentioned learn from those who adapt to their needs. Do you have any examples?
Yes, I do. We have a learner in the further education sector. They were able to use their phone to access the VLE to read alongside the course notes because they couldn't see the presentation in room. And when the teacher suggested that accessibility would be widened for the class and highlighted this feature, the learner actually didn't want that feature made available because they thought, I've got a secret weapon. So accessibility could possibly be considered as an educational secret weapon.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, there's something really there's something rigorous about asking your students to consider accessibility because it's an epistemological question. It gets at exactly how people know the world around them. And, at a sort of different level than what you're asking, Kevin, you think about how do you engage your students? Well, in some ways you can engage them by engaging their brains, right? Like getting them encountering a different way of knowing in the world can be an exciting revelatory moment for them, in what might otherwise seem in other contexts as like a kind of a boring sort of this is how I format my work conversation. It's not that. It's actually helping them see the world in a whole new way.
Can I ask the group something about, potential resources? I have seen and have, been involved with a few resources that are, they feel like they're pretty hardcore for accessibility professionals. I haven't done them myself either, but some of the people I work with have, and they're amazing. But to me, there feels like that there's either a gap or I'm not aware of resources where, for example, faculty members, right now, if someone were to do faculty development at an institution, is there, a good set of universal design or accessibility resources that is like level set at, sort of specifically for faculty members, working with students with accessibility needs? And I'm not talking about like the few pages of resources on a website, but like really something that someone can go through as a develop, as faculty development. Oh, awesome. I think it'd be awesome if the task force can, collect them, and then we can list them as resources, especially for faculty. Ona, would you be able to share a link to that course? Oh, perfect.
We have it on a slide coming up, although I'm realizing having a hyperlink probably doesn't help as much on a slideshow. Talk about accessibility. None of you can access it, but we'll share the slides afterwards here. Yeah.
Yeah, I made them links anticipating that we would make the
Oh,
slides
good. Okay.
available. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then another one, Jeff, a group out of Sonoma State University created something called UDL Universe, and it's specifically designed to help faculty either in a professional development setting or on their own go through and apply UDL to different aspects of their course, including their syllabus. And so it's got some good resources, some good activities, and some good examples of faculty creating a graphic syllabus to support students who might need a different structure, like the concept maps that were described earlier, and other. And I see we have another page by Ahead Ireland in the chat from Orna. Thanks.
And I think it's the University of Kentucky. They have an entire podcast network and had a 10-part series on UDL, which they called UDL in a nutshell. So for everybody on any of the podcast apps, you should be able to find that fairly easily, but I did put the link into the chat as well. And that is really very short episodes on individual topics that are then discussed by Jennifer Pusateri in conversation with David Cole.
Christina, that's great. And that reminds me of another one called Think UDL, which is a podcast out of Appalachian State University here in the United States by Lillian Nave. And I know we're pretty heavy on the UDL resources, so we'll try to get some related specifically to accessibility. I know the California Virtual Campus has an open Canvas course with some instructions on how to apply accessibility through those 7 bullets that I brought up earlier in those 4 headings. And I think there's some others that, again, to your point, Jeff, don't expect that you're either an expert. Try to meet instructors and students where they are so that they can take these ideas and run with them. Zeta brings up a good point that we need to curate these lists so that it's not information overload. And then a question in the chat. In addition to asking students to run assignments through plagiarism checkers, what if we had them run through accessibility checkers? I know some institutions use tools like Blackboard Ally, which will look at the accessibility of artifacts within a course. I don't know if it can be used in that way on the fly for things that students submit, but that's a great idea. And I know that there are tools out there for Adobe, for Microsoft, for other even web pages. If you use the browser like Chrome, they do have accessibility checkers built in for specific formats, but it would be nice to have kind of a universal checker. And it looks like Orna has a Moodle accessibility checker for the courses, but I'd be interested to see how that applies to student submissions as well.
Thanks everybody for sharing your thoughts. Kevin, are you all right to keep on trucking? So really, we wanted to offer up some next steps. You all can reach out to us at the Digital Ethics Task Force at our email address. So it's AAEEBL Digital Task Force at gmail.com. And we're also open to feedback on a survey here at bit.ly/digital ethics feedback. So you can give us any sort of feedback you had on the session. yeah, we're always looking for more resources, more more angles to some of these questions, because the principles themselves are kind of always under review and revision. And as Kevin mentioned, we'll be sharing these slides out. You know, if you're in Ireland ahead, as I think has been made clear, there's a lot of the chat today is an organization that's gonna that has some pretty robust resources for creating inclusive, accessible environments in education. And then CAST in North America, for those of us interested in UDL, they also have guidelines there for folks on campuses. But I think other than that, that's largely what we had. Kevin, do you have any other closing remarks, or anybody else from the task force here?
No, only to thank folks for sharing all the great ideas in the chat and via voice, and we'll do our best to kind of aggregate them and curate them to the point made earlier that we don't want to create this massive list that is impenetrable and hard to figure out where to go next. But we're just grateful to have people from across 12 time zones. We started at 6 a.m. The next day in New Zealand and 6 p.m. in Ireland. And so it's just great to have folks from so many different places and points of view.
Thank you all so much, and hope you have a great day, evening.